Now, a year and a half of war has left Sudan on the brink of total collapse. The army has been fighting the paramilitary rapid support forces, leaving more than 25 million people suffering from extreme violence, hunger and forced displacement. The Norwegian Refugee Council says last month alone, more than 2,500 people were killed and 250,000 were newly displaced. The conflict has triggered the largest displacement crisis in the world, with over 11 million people internally displaced. 3 million Sudanese have fled to Chad, Egypt, South Sudan and other neighbouring countries. That's putting added pressure on an already scarce resource situation. The Norwegian Refugee Council says an estimated 1.5 million people are facing severe hunger, and more than half the population are in acute need of food. The fighting is hindering efforts to deliver aid. Jan Egeland is the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He left Sudan on Friday, joins us now from N'Djamena in Chad. Good to have you with us. So as I've been explaining, your organisation is warning of total collapse. How far are we, Mr. Egeland, from total collapse? What kind of timeline are we looking at?
Because there is this relentless countdown to famine.
I'm sorry, Mr. Egeland, we lost you there for a moment, and I fear that we may have lost a very important beginning of your statement. So apologies for that. And if I can ask you to pick up again on the question of, how far we might be from total collapse at this point.
I fear we're only months away from this total, complete countdown to famine, to a unimaginable suffering, because already millions and millions of people are one step away from famine. There was famine declared in northern Darfur. I came out from Darfur yesterday. I was in El Geneina, West Darfur. There are few organizations really having any scale of assistance there. And in big parts of Sudan, there is too little aid, no protection for civilians. The international community is not treating Sudan as it should, namely the biggest humanitarian drama, the biggest suffering on our watch. Nowhere else on the planet are so many lives at stake.
So many lives at stake, very strong words. What would total collapse mean for those millions of lives?
I think what we fear is that there is a total breakdown of law and order, of command and control for the very many men that are roaming around with arms. It's not just two sides. There are many armed actors now. There is a collapsing economy. The parties to the armed conflict are not enabling our humanitarian relief. Cross-front line is very difficult and often impossible. The cross-border aid from Chad to Darfur has been switched on and off. The international community is not giving us the funding that we need as organizations. Many of the largest agencies are not there on the ground in the remote areas of Sudan where the suffering is the biggest. But it's also possible to do things. I was very glad yesterday morning to see hundreds of bakeries that are giving the daily subsidized bread now to hundreds of thousands of people. This is a US aid-funded program through the Norwegian Refugee Council, and we will soon be up to 900 bakeries that will have flour and subsidies so that they can give bread on a price that people can afford. That's one way of reaching people before famine grips the country.
If there is one immediate step that the world must take in order to protect those millions of lives which you said are at stake, what would that step be?
Well, I mean, number one is stop the violence. How do you stop the violence, really? Well, I would say, can we at least stop the arms flow into the country? There are too many international actors, some of them in the Gulf countries, by the way, that bring fuel to the fire. The warlords do not lack arms. We lack funding. We lack food. We lack what is needed to assist the population. But I would also say, let's put it on the global agenda as it deserves. 20 years ago, I was the UN Humanitarian Relief Coordinator for the world. There was a crisis in Darfur, and we got President Bush at the time, Prime Minister Blair in the UK, the French president, the EU Commission, the Gulf countries on the highest levels to act, push the government for access, and gave all of the money we needed for the operation. Today, the crisis is 3 times what it was at that time, and we're met with neglect. So we also needed to have it on the international agenda so that we can scale up our work, so that there can be pressure on the parties on a much different scale, so that they end the violence and enable us to reach the many, many millions who are now hungry, suffering, and fear the future inside Sudan.
You've been visiting with some of the refugees in Chad. We know also that there are 11 million displaced people internally. Just give us an overview of who the most vulnerable are and the challenges of what they need.
Well, in all of these camps, I was also in a camp in Port Sudan, which is the easiest accessible place in Sudan, possibly. It's where the Sudan Armed Forces have their headquarters, and President Burhan sits there. The humanitarian country team of the United Nations is there. Just outside, there is a camp of 3,700 people, and there's not even food distributions there. So these women and children that are the most vulnerable, as they always are, many of them are widows. They have sick children. They have starving children, malnourished children, and there is no hope in sight for return to their ancestral land, and there is not even enough aid reaching them. We're doing as much as we can. Norwegian Refugee Council has now 400 aid workers on the ground inside Sudan, and we will increase further as we hope to get more funding. We hope really the world responds. We hope the Gulf countries come with now generous contributions, and that the Gulf countries push the parties to stop this. This is, after all, a neighbor to the Gulf countries.
All right, thank you so much for your time and speaking to us. Jan Egeland there, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.